honor to introduce to you our current U.S. champion, Shanklin. He lives in Northern California, and he is one of our best players in the country that this country has ever produced, at least contemporarily. And he's going to show you guys one of his best games from last year's U.S. Championship that he won, and the last 15 minutes is going to be question-answer. So if you have any questions, please save it for later. For now, I'll give him the tribune, and he can introduce himself. He is one of the top 30 players in the world. He came to the ranks real fast last few years. He's won many tournaments internationally and locally. And I'll let him to speak further.
All right. So welcome everybody. I'm glad to be in Los Angeles. This is actually my first time in the LA Chess Club. I don't get to come down here too often, but I'm meeting some friends, and I thought the best thing I can do in my spare time is to talk to some of the local chess players here. I like to inspire the next generation of American players, and I hope I can touch some hearts today. Anyhow, we're going to start by looking at the game that I played that won me the U.S. Championship last year, which was a game against the Wonder Liang. You may feel free to ask questions about the game at any point. I'm not very good at just talking into the ether without any correspondence, so I'm going to try to call on people and ask questions. I'm just going to please ask that you raise your hand. And for the purpose of this lecture, all of you will have the same name, which is Hey You. But so we're going to get started. So going into this game, I was I was half a point ahead of the field, and I had white against a Wonder Liang, who was the youngest participant at 15 and the lowest rated. He was our U.S. junior champion, but clearly he's tough, and there was a lot more pressure on me. And I certainly wanted to close this tournament out today, or that day, and I didn't want to let it get to tie break. So I thought playing for a win was, well, I'm playing white anyway, so I should be doing that. Anyhow, I started off with Caro-Kann, e4, c6, d4, d5. Now, I'm quite convinced that the best move here is e5. I think this is the most principled way for white to fight for an advantage. But in this game, especially against such a young kid, I thought it was better to play a longer game. In particular, I was hoping I could count on my physical fitness, that after 11 rounds, I'm still strong and healthy while some of my opponents will be suffering. So I went for the quieter line with e takes d5. Now, after cd, I'm aiming to play some sort of reversed Queen's Gambit with an extra tempo, and I think white is still fighting for an advantage here, but it's not as principled as what I could have done. But under the circumstances, I was happy with my decision. So the game follows knight c6, c3, knight f6, bishop f4. And white has a very harmonious development scheme available to him. Just knight d2, knight gf3, castle. He has a very safe position. He has some chances to apply pressure to black. And I believe black is fine, but it's not that easy to prove, and especially for opponent who's caught by surprise. So the game followed bishop g4, queen b3. Now, who knows what black played here? Yes?
Queen b6.
Queen b6 I don't love because it leaves black with this isolated pawn on b6. Note that it's specifically because the pawns on c5 and e3 have been traded that this pawn can become a weakness. For instance, already if I play bishop c7, black will be forced to play something ugly like knight d7 to keep it alive. So white is trying to pressure that pawn on b7, and black has to do something about it. Anybody know another move for black? Yes, sir.
b6?
b6 is loosening black's position a little bit, and after this move, the pin on the knight is pretty annoying. I think the most natural moves are the ones that defend this pawn while also bringing out a new piece. Queen d7 is the main move in this position, and the one I was expecting most. My favorite move from the black side, because I have played this position with black multiple times, I've played queen c8. The point is that on d7, following knight d2, e6, and now knight gf3, this knight e5 move can become pretty annoying. Like, for example, if black just continues developing normally after knight e5, the queen has to move because after takes and takes, here white is winning on account of the hanging knight as well as the threat of bishop b5. So I've always liked queen c8 myself, which just keeps the queen on a safer square so that in a position like this one, if knight e5 comes, black can comfortably take it without having to worry about the pin, and he's cleared the d7 square for his knight. In my view, black is more or less okay here, but my opponent did something much more rash, which is if your opponent is making a threat to the pawn on b7 in this case, for example, in general, you're probably best advised to defend against that threat, but you can also threaten something bigger in response. And a wonder uncorked this kind of ridiculous move e5. blowing up the center, hanging a second pawn, but trying to prove that black had a lead in development. And it's actually a very principled idea, because if I take this pawn with the bishop, then funnily enough, after queen e7, this guy is protected. The bishop is pinned, and black is immediately ready to take twice on e5, bring his queen to the center. He will castle queenside, bishop c5, rook h e8. All of his pieces join the fight extremely quickly. He will get his pawn back, and I think already white's actually just worse. And if I take with the pawn on e5, then knight h5 will come. My bishop will have to go away. Let's say bishop e3. Black takes his pawn back, counterattacks my bishop. Okay, I think black is fine here. He has an isolated pawn, but he's ahead in development. Does that sort of make sense to everybody? Yeah, so I was in, but luckily I was prepared. So e5 came, and I found the best move. And the whole point that I was noticing was that, for example, if I take on b7, and he takes on f4, it's very important that after this check, that black's bishop is free to come back to d7, right? Otherwise, black would be in serious trouble. In addition, it's important that black has the h5 square available to his knight. And finally, after bishop takes e5, like we saw, queen e7, it's very important that black is taking his pawn back right now on e5 and that white doesn't have the defending developing move, knight f3, available. So all of this is possible for black, specifically because bishop on g4 is literally the perfect bishop. It's on exactly the square it needs to be. Luckily for white, it's not stable there, and white can kick it away. So what should white play here? Yes, sir? H3 is the best move. So white is, again, ignoring the threat to his own bishop by counterattacking black's bishop. And here, I think black's already under a lot of pressure. Now, I believe the only tenable move for him is knight a5, ignoring threats even more and making it an even bigger threat to white's queen. And the point is that he is kicking white's queen when she has to specifically retreat and cannot advance. If she comes to a square like this, for example, this is very foolish, because now black drops his bishop back with a gain of tempo and white will lose the piece on f4. So white would have to go queen c2. And then the point is, in this position here, black's position is absolutely wretched. White has a better structure, better development and everything, but black can grab a pawn and hope to hold on for dear life. Now, most people would not enjoy playing chess like this. I know I certainly wouldn't. But the whole point is at least you have a pawn for your suffering, and a pawn can count at the end of the game, of course. So here, the computer offers queen e2 check, forking the king and knight. Queen e7 is forced. And I think it wants knight h3 to try to take the pawn back, but I wasn't so keen to trade queens. My plan was to play this sort of funny move, king f1, which now queen e2 check, honest to goodness, will win a piece because the knight is hanging. And black will have to lose time defending it, and in the meantime, knight d2 and rook e1 check is coming, and the black king will never be able to comfortably castle kingside because of the h-file. So I thought there was enormous compensation for white here, but at least black has a pawn for his suffering. Instead, black made a different move. He chose to take on f4 directly instead of playing knight a5 first. And here we see a key difference. Why can black not take on g4? What will white do in response? Yes, sir. Okay. Anyone else? Yes.
Queen d1.
Well, queen d1 would attack the knight. So following knight takes g4, black has taken a pawn. You can attack the knight with queen d1, but unfortunately I think black will get away with the knight, and all you've done is undevelop white's queen, who was sitting on a pretty good square before. Yeah. So here the point is, since black has not included the moves knight a5 and queen c2, this b7 pawn is hanging. And I think that it's quite clear the b7 pawn was worth more than the g4 pawn. Black's queenside is in shambles, and in fact, he's losing on the spot if he doesn't play queen e7 check right now, forcing a pretty bad endgame. So that's not good for black. So instead, a wonder tried queen e7 check, which makes some sense. He defends the pawn with a gain of tempo, and he's ready to castle queenside. But I was quite happy with this position, so I played the move king f1. In general, I think my king is very good here because I think it's almost better than castling, because my king is, there's two reasons to castle. One, to get your king safe, and two, to activate your rook. And here, since my king on f1 clearly will not be harassed anytime soon, but my rook on h1 is already active thanks to my playing h takes g4 and opening the h-file, I'm quite satisfied having played king f1. So the game continues, castles long, and I went knight d2. Of course, black cannot take on g4 now. What would happen to him if he did this? Bishop f5 check, yes, and the knight and the king are forked, and this is not good news for black. So instead, black played the move g6, which is not a bad move at all, but it's also not a particularly subtle move. What does black want to do? Yes, what would he like to do? Okay. h5 is a thought, but yes?
G5?
Well, he could have played g5 last move. In fact, actually, g5 was the best move. It was better than what he did. Yes?
Bishop G7.
Does the bishop look very good there? Remember, we were trying to take on g4 last move. Why couldn't we take on g4? Right. Now there's no longer a fork available. So at this point, the pawn on g4 actually is under attack. So what's white going to do about that? f3. So when we do this, we have loosened the e3 square around white's king, and more importantly, how does this knight feel? Not very happy, right? First of all, do we need to save this pawn on g4? Remember, if you have to defend against your opponent's threats, you have to do that. But one thing you can do is threaten something bigger. And in fact, white's best move simply... White's best move is rook e1. This brings a passive rook on a1 into the game and makes the counter threat against black's queen so that black is unable to take the time to take on g4. Okay, black moved his queen. Now we still have the same problem. g4 is hanging, but we've made some progress. Now, 3 things you can do when something of yours is under attack. You can defend it, you can move it away from being attacked, or you can threaten something bigger. We just saw white threaten something bigger a second ago, and that gained him a move. Now we have to choose what to do about the pawn. Do we defend it, or do we move it away?
G5.
Yes. g5 advances very nicely. And note that it's very important that white had included the move rook e1 before g5. Had he started with g5 without rook e1, after a move like knight h5, now black would be ready to meet rook e1 with taking this pawn. So it's very smart of white to have first played rook e1, kicking the queen out of the way, and now after g5, and only now g5, so that following knight h5, we're no longer hanging here. So at this point, I'd like to slow down a little bit. We've gone pretty quickly through the first phase of this game because I think the moves have been relatively easy so far and not too hard to grasp. But this is the first, I think, really serious decision white has to make, and the first one I spent a fair amount of time on. In order to land on what I believe what I played is the best move. It's a complicated enough position that I could still be wrong, but I believe it is. So in order to figure out what it is, you have to think about what white's plan is in the next few moves, as well as what black's plan is. So does anyone think, what would be a good plan for white in this position?
Develop that last G knight.
Yes, where does this knight want to go? Okay, that's a good start. But imagine this were Bughouse. We'll take this knight off the board. What's the best square to put it on? h3, not so much. It doesn't do very much. I would say e5 is the best square. Now, knight f3 definitely is on the way to e5, so clearly from g1, this is where the knight wants to go, right? The problem is you can't get to e5 with this knight here. This knight has to be booted off of its perch. Which piece is going to do that?
Bishop.
Right. So white's best plan is to play knight gf3 and bishop b5. Makes perfect sense. We want to bring in our last piece, bring it to a great square. In order to do that, we have to trade off this knight. Nothing could be more natural. However, that's only considering what we want to achieve in this position, while not also considering what our opponents want to achieve. What is black trying to pull off right now?
Bishop E7, Bishop E7.
That's a thought, and it definitely becomes relevant. We'll check it later on. But when bishop e7 comes, at least with my knight here, bishop g5 is not coming. You're correct in identifying that this pawn is a serious wedge in the position that really is annoying you quite a bit if you're playing black, right? So if that g5 pawn is such an annoying wedge, what's a plan that black has at his disposal to get rid of it? h6. This move really scared me. If black's able to play h6, he will get rid of my pawn wedge on g5 that was dominating this knight, and more importantly, if these pawns trade, knight g3 check becomes a huge threat. That's not that easy to deal with. Make sense to everybody? So what I had decided was, okay, I want to play knight f3 and bishop b5 and then fight for the e5 square, but I do not want to let black play h6, and he's ready to do it next move. And knight f3 and bishop b5 is a little bit slower. So I thought my highest priority right now is find a way to stop h6. So what should white do? Yes. Rook takes h5. So that's giving material. What do you get for your material? You have to speak up, sorry. You close the h file, but an exchange is quite a bit of material. I mean, are you sure you want to do that? Knight h3, that sort of closes the h file, but at the same time, we're now starting to deviate from our plan of bringing this knight towards e5. The problem right now is, if you think about the h6 square, if black plays h6, you're threatening with one pawn to take it, and black's got two pieces to none defending it. So it seems like black's in control of h6. But in fact, this sleeping rook here, when these rooks are looking at each other, the whole reason that it's working so well for black is that this knight on h5 is blocking the h-file, and it will move when black decides it's necessary. However, g4, there's going to be en passant. But
Rook h3, rh3.
yeah, that doesn't do very much after h6, I think. The best move is bishop e2. This bishop will not stay here for long. Eventually it will come to b5. But in the meantime, white is threatening bishop takes h5, which will win a pawn and leave him in a strategically crushing position. So black has to respect this threat, right? He plays knight g7. Now, is black ready to play h6 or not?
No.
No, we got too many guys. This rook on h1 and the pawn on g5, he can't play h6. So now and only now it's time for white to start executing his own plan with knight gf3 because h6 has been prevented. So black goes knight e6. And then I played bishop b5, threatening that knight and hoping to slam in on the e5 square. Now, in the game, black played bishop g7, which is a really sad move because this bishop is going to be biting on granite on this dark squared pawn chain that white is so expertly set up, while white's light squared bishop is far superior where none of black's pawns are dominating it. Now, he did this it may well have been the best move, but understandably he was fearful of the knight advance to e5. Let's say black had chosen something more combative and gone with this gentleman's plan of playing bishop e7 to harass the g5 pawn. This was a very serious attempt that black can make to try to change the course of the game, because if black can take this pawn and get away with it, not only will he have taken material, but this all-important e5 square that we're fighting for will suddenly fall into black's hands very quickly because he has f6 whenever he wants it. Seems like a very logical move, right? So, what should white do here? That's a thought. I think the problem is black can take with the queen, and I'm not sure about this position. Knight e5, and now it's very important that black has this intermediate move check, so we're not in time to take f7 with complete devastation. Following something like king g1, now black can play knight takes g5 and save his f7 pawn. Probably white should take on f7 anyway and then take with his rook, but at this point the position is not so clear. I think black's not doing so badly right now. White will have to trade off the knight on e5 if he wants to equalize material. So the real problem was by playing bishop takes c6, we're only looking at the e5 square. We're not making any additional weaknesses, and black is gaining time with his queen. You want to exert more pressure on this knight if at all possible. Can we think of a way to do that? Yes. Queen a4. Excellent move. Now we're threatening to take on c6 when black will have to take back with the pawn because a7 is hanging. And in fact, black can't actually do anything about it because if he tries to defend a7 with here, then bishop takes c6 will still butcher the pawn structure. So here, black's position is in shambles. Now he might as well try to take a pawn for his struggles. But here we see that white's play is just more powerful. Following bishop takes c6, black cannot take with the queen because we will trade queens and then the bishop hangs. So he has to take with the pawn, and now white slams in with knight e5. We note the stark contrast is that now black has this additional weakness on c6, and in fact it simply cannot be defended. Let's say black tries to defend it with rook d6. How should white proceed? He has more than one good move, but I think one is the most convincing.
Knight takes c6.
Absolutely, yes. Always examine all checks and captures. This pawn is not actually that well defended. Black can take back, but the problem is after rook takes c6, black's up a piece for the moment, but his queen is overworked, and after rook takes e7, material has been equalized, and black's position is really a train wreck. He will lose the d5 pawn for sure, and then white will be left with a 4-on-1 majority that's going to really roll down the board. So this is just bad news for black. It's not white's only good move, but the whole point was this pawn, it's attacked twice, but it's not actually defended once yet because that queen is going to be overworked with the bishop on e7. So here, I think black is in really bad shape. I'm sure my opponent saw this variation, and that's what convinced him to play this passive move, bishop g7. He was worried that he will just get destroyed if he tries to come after my g5 pawn. Frankly, he's right, but still, it's very sad to play such a move. Now, in this position, if you consider the quality of black's knights, they're really dominated. This knight can't come to f4 or g5. This pawn dominates both of them. The bishop is really bad, nailing down on this pawn chain. White's rook keeps the black rook on h8 passive. White's position would be completely winning strategically if not for one problem that he's facing. Has anyone ever heard the... Yes, sir?
The knight on d2.
Exactly. All of white's other pieces are picture perfect. His king is safe as can be. Both his rooks are active. Everything. This knight is really bad. It's dominated by the black pawn on d5. All of white's other pieces are great. And when you need to improve one piece to make your position better, it should be relatively easy to find a plan. So once again, we're going to take this knight off the board and play bug house. If we want to drop this knight on the board, what's its best square? E5 and c5. Neither of them are safe, but they're both really good squares to be sort of lasering down on. So what square should we put the knight on? Yes, sir?
e5.
Well, e5 is not safe right now because the knight and the bishop are both attacking it. But you want to have knight e5 available, and you want to have knight c5 available.
d3.
Yes, the knight coming to d3 would be an excellent knight. I think, okay, how do we get the knight to d3?
Just pick it up and drop it on d3.
Doesn't quite work. b3 is the quickest way to get there is through b3. Yes, the queen has to move out of the way first. So where should the queen go? Yes, queen a4. So this also creates the incidental threat of bishop takes c6, which would really cripple black's pawn structure around his king. So black found the best move, which was rook d6. And his point is that if bishop takes c6, he can take with the rook, when it would be exceptionally foolish to take on a7 with the queen because of rook a6. It's a very bad way to lose the US championship. So, but after rook d6, it's funny, the computer was suggesting b4 with some attacking concepts, but this feels very strange to me because it would make a weakness on c3 in a position where black otherwise has no plan. And I simply went along with knight b3, keeping in touch with my same plan of improving my knight. Now, black really needed to play a6 here to challenge my bishop. I was going to take this knight. And then, again, the computer wanted to sort of push the chaos button to some degree with knight c5. It makes some sense. It wants to trade these knights. If something like takes, it's pointing out you cannot comfortably take this pawn on pain of rook e8 check, and maybe white's ready with rook h4 and then double attack the f4 pawn. Computers are good at chess. It certainly found this idea, but I saw a much simpler solution, which was just to bring this knight back and get ready to come to d3 if needed. And I thought that white would just be better. It's not the end of the world for black. He probably should have played like that, although he's still suffering a bit. Instead, he played b6. Now, this is my first chance to plug my book. Why is b6 a bad move? Yes.
Queen to a6.
Well, that's not a great move right now, but you're right to be looking at exactly this square as a weakness. Weakness is on the light squares. And the whole premise of my book, Small Steps to Giant Improvement, is the concept pawns do not move backwards. The pawn move is a permanent decision. b6 is understandable. A wonder clearly was worried about this move, knight c5. There's no other reason for him to play b6. And this is a move he should be worried about. But in this case, the cure was worse than the disease. So these pawns will never... His king will never find safety again. The light squares are going to be too vulnerable. Now, again, the computer found knight e5, but I was just a man on a mission. Get this knight to d3 as soon as possible. All right, so knight b8 happened, knight d3, king b7. So black's last two moves have not been bad moves, but again, they're not subtle. And they pretty directly advertise the move he'd like to play next. What is black planning on doing? Yes. Sorry? Someone? A6. I mean, that would, for now, it would simply actually trap this bishop, and black would win a piece. but even if white moves the queen away, in general, getting his pawns onto the light squares will restrict my light squared bishop, who doesn't really have an opponent because his bishop operates on dark squares. So a6 clearly is black's plan. So what should we do? Yes, knight b4. This prevents a6, and the knight is now looking at all these juicy weakened light squares, a6, c6, and the pawn on d5. Now, I might say to you, well, knight b4, I'm just going to kick your knight away. Don't you have to go right back where you came from? Yeah, you do.
But it's a weakness.
Yes. Now, the thing is, black says, okay, you know what? I have a bad position, and you just made the same move back to back, repeating moves. Why don't I repeat moves? Okay, a7, your move. That's not how chess works. And this is the whole premise. Pawns do not move backwards. If you take this position, basically what white's done is instead of playing the move knight b4, he just played the move a5 for his opponent and said, okay, now it's your move again. And this is a huge problem for black because now this bishop will sit here for the rest of the game. It will never get hit by a6. And finally, white also now has a hook to latch onto. Who knows what a hook is? Yes?
A hook is a pawn that defends a knight on an outpost.
Not quite.
A protruding portion of a pawn formation that can be a target for attack by pushing pawns at it.
Yeah, my definition of a hook is basically a pawn that cannot move, and ergo, when it's attacked by another pawn, a line will open. Does that make sense? This pawn on a5 is now a hook. At any moment white wants, he's ready to play b4, and either the a file or the b file is going to open, and black's king is going to start getting taken for a ride. Make sense to everybody? A second ago, black had a really miserable position, but there's no way for me to immediately get to his king. But by playing knight b4 and provoking a5, now following knight d3, I have a very clear plan to play b4 and blast the queenside open, and his king will likely perish. So I was totally content to burn 2 tempi if it meant black had to play a5. It keeps my bishop good, and then I will have possibilities to attack the king. So probably a5 had to be played, but a wonder played queen d8. Now this makes some sense. He's overprotecting the d5 pawn, which could be a weakness, and again, he's exerting some pressure on the g5 pawn. But at this point, I found a really nice move that I think more or less closed out the game. There was still plenty of stuff to do after that, but at this point, I was pretty sure I was taking down the title. We've talked in a lot of very general strategic terms about this game so far because it's been a very general and strategic game, very positional. But you'll find that even in the most subtle of struggles, you'll always have tactics and calculation. And here white has to calculate well. He has a very nice move at his disposal that, if calculated properly, leads to a huge advantage. So let's see if anybody has a suggestion of what to play.
Knight c6.
That's going to hang because I have too many guys defending the square. But you're looking in the right direction. You'd like to pull off something like knight c6, but okay, knight e5 has been called. So this brings the knight to the square that a long time ago we outlined we wanted to get to, right? There's 2 problems with this move. One, your g5 pawn is hanging, and instead of defending it, you removed one of your defenders from it. And the other is that this proud knight on e5 can now get chopped off by this stupid bishop on g7, and that's a trade that black's happy to make. So this move on the surface looks pretty bad, right? However, let's start calculating. What is white threatening with this move? Knight takes f7 is one threat, but he has another threat as well. Yeah, knight c6 is the other threat. If we go knight c6, and we go something like takes, this game is over. The black king will not survive. For example, king b8, bishop takes d5. You cannot take on account of knight c6 when the queen is lost. This game is finished. So knight c6 and knight takes g5 are both really serious threats. And knight takes f7. So let's say black played knight takes g5. What can be more natural? I take your pawn, and I stop this major threat of knight takes f7. And we see after knight c6, bishop c6 was good enough, but let's say knight c6 is the simplest. And I see a small number of threats, such as queen a6, queen a7, knight d8, rook e7. It's very clear black is not surviving this position. He's just done. That makes sense to everybody? So the first thing we realize about knight e5 is that black cannot chop on g5. The next thing we have to think is, well, what are we accomplishing with this move if black can trade off his bad bishop for white's good knight. This seems like a bad trade. But in fact, after bishop takes e5, black is facing a problem. What is that problem? Trapped rook. There's still a little bit more to see because black can play knight c5 to counterattack white's queen and clear the e6 square for his rook. But the calculation is pretty straightforward. Just checks and captures all the way through. What should white play? Well, then after rook e6, black's certainly not happy, but he's not dead. White has a better move. Look for forceful moves, checks and captures.
Bishop c6.
That will hang the bishop. The rook can take it.
Queen a1.
Queen d1 is decent. This one, now after rook e6, which is forced, now white will take the d5 pawn. This should win, I think, eventually, but it's not the most incisive. I think we'll call this exercise off because I do believe this move does win. But the best move is actually just to keep on going with, e takes d6. Now you're sacrificing your queen, but it's not a long-term thing. You can just calculate straight to the end. E takes d6, knight takes a4. Are we taking this knight back? No. What's white going to do? Rook e7 checks, slamming in. Now this king is really starting to suffer. Of course, black cannot take the rook. At this point, material has been equalized as black had to give the queen back, and now e8 queen cannot be stopped, which will cost black his rook. He'll end up a rook down. So after rook e7 check, he's got to move his king. If king c8, what do we play? Yes. Then black will take it, and then you lose. Be careful. Rook c7, and this would be checkmate, but black has to give up his queen back. And now again, equal material, but now black has two hanging knights. He will lose one of them, and white will be a piece to the good and win the game. So that's relatively straightforward. And finally, the last attempt black has is to play king a8. That works, but in general, this is an important concept to understand. A lot of the times I hear people complaining that they had a winning position and they didn't win the game. Now, after bishop c6 check, this is a mistake and you still have a winning position. But often, the first step towards not winning a one game is a move that makes the win difficult rather than impossible. Knight c6 is much more direct. After bishop c6 takes, and black takes this rook, I mean, this endgame should just win. e8 is sort of hanging over black's head, so rook takes h7 is coming next. I mean, I do believe white should win this endgame without a ton of discussion, but you haven't knocked out your opponent as fast as you could have, and as directly as you could have. So yeah, the other move, bringing the knight to c6 is better. And yeah, in this position, after knight c6, the threat of rook takes a7 checkmate is completely devastating, and if black takes the rook, now that the bishop is still alive, this pawn will just queen. And if knight takes c6, bishop takes c6 check, rook b7 check, this is gone. If king a8, rook b6 is mate, and if king c8, d7 wins the queen for just a pawn. So this is completely crushing. It wasn't a super long variation, it wasn't a super difficult variation, but still it's important to be calculating well, and it's easy to sort of forget about calculation when you're playing such a strategic game. So going back, after knight e5, black's really in a tough spot because of these twin threats of knight takes f7, and because these twin threats of knight takes f7 and knight c6 are very hard to meet. So black, and considering he can't take the knight, so black brought his queen back to c7, which was his only way to try to stop both threats. And now I sort of think about black's position as almost like if you have a raft that has holes in it, and you're using your fingers to plug the holes, and black just barely plugged all of them. If you just make the tiniest little pencil prick and plug one more hole, he's not going to hold it together. And in fact, here all white has to do is just make one simple threat, and black's position falls apart on the spot because all of his pieces are have too many defensive tasks at their disposal. What can white do to break down the defenses? Knight f7 loses your knight to queen takes f7. I mean, right now, black has three very vulnerable pawns that are under attack, that are defended by pieces, not by other pawns. Which are those pawns? h7 is one, d5 is the second, and what's the last one? All three of these are defended exactly by one piece and one piece only, right? Now, if you attacked any of these pawns a second time, they could not be defended again. because black's too busy defending too many pawns. So all white needs to do is attack one of these pawns and the game is over. This is the best move. Queen b3. White attacks the d5 pawn, like the main central pawn that's been holding black's position together for all this time. And black simply cannot defend it. There's nothing he can do. Between d5, f7, and h7, one of them is going to go right now. And there's no way for black to stop it. If he tries taking the knight, yes, he's traded off his bad bishop. Probably should have tried this, but after this, with 3 attackers on d5, d5 will clearly fall. And once d5 falls and this bishop reroutes to f3, this is not going to end well for black. So instead, black played the best move he could, which was rook hd8, defending the most important pawn. But now finally, white's last piece that was semi-passive this entire game enters the game with authority, slamming in on h7, picking up a pawn while he's at it. Again, black cannot take this knight on e5 because after d takes e5, the rook is trapped. And he also cannot take the pawn on g5 because the rook is attacking the bishop, who only has the knight to cover it. He tried a6, bishop d3. Now, what black would really like to do is play bishop takes e5, and now, because now that this bishop is gone from b5, d takes e5 will not trap the rook and he can come back. Now this pawn will fall and black is fighting back. Make sense to everybody? The problem is that after bishop takes e5, I will take with the rook, and now this pawn is again going to be lost because I have too many attackers on it. So I think what makes the most sense is for black to instead play the move a5, kick my knight away, and then after this take on e5. Because now after rook takes e5, my knight is gone. It's not attacking this guy anymore. And all of a sudden, knight c6, this rook has to leave. Then this rook leaves, knight takes pawn. Then this rook has to leave. White's starting to get beaten backwards and black is fighting back. Make sense to everybody? However, there's a small flaw with this for black. So in this position, after bishop d3, a5, white's not going to play knight c2. What's he going to play?
Knight takes d5.
Yeah. And after rook takes d5, you've lost a knight, but what happens? Right. And now this rook is pinned to the king. If white can take it, he will be up 2 pawns in an exchange, so black can try to defend it with queen d6. And after knight takes f7, I actually counted this. I think black will lose both rooks, his e6 knight, and his g7 bishop just for this knight. That's not a very good trade. You don't get rich making trades like that. So this is really not good. So black would like to play a5, but he's still unprepared to do so. So he played king a7. Again, not a particularly subtle move. The guy wants to play a5 now that I won't have the knight takes d5 tactic anymore. However, now I have a move to prepare for a5 coming. And I found, I think, a pretty nice one. Running a little short on time, so I'm just going to speed up the last little bit. My queen on b3 doesn't actually do that much. She came back to b3 to drive black's rook to d8, which let my rook come in. Now that that's already happened, my queen on b3 has served her purpose, and she can come back where she was before. Queen a4, threatening knight takes a6 with immediate devastation. Black plays a5, and now the point is my knight does not have to move because of the pin, and instead bishop b5 comes back. Now knight c6 is again a threat, and once again this knight cannot be taken because after d5 this bishop is back and the rook is once again trapped. So black's really in a bad way here. Instead of that, black tried king b7 to unpin his pawn, and now this knight is hanging, but now my knight comes back to d3. And it's funny, if we recall this, we saw this idea before of knight b4 back to d3 to provoke a5. All that happened, but in addition, white was able to bring his rook to h7 too, taking a pawn and bringing in the rook. So this position is just collapsing for black. I'll just show the rest of the game pretty quickly. Rook g8, defending the bishop. Now this guy's actually hanging. Knight f3 back here. And now I could have played b4 or something violent like that. And if I felt like there was any pressure on me at all to do something right now, if I felt like black had any counterplay, I probably would have considered this kind of thing pretty seriously. But I just felt this knight and this bishop were so unintimidating that I was ready to play even slower. I played a3. Not a subtle move, but not a bad one. I just want b4. And I want to be able to take back with the a pawn instead of something else. Very simple. And again, because I didn't think black was doing anything, I was happy to do it. So instead, black tried knight c6. And here, b4 certainly was good enough in playing for mate, but I saw the opportunity to just force a bunch of trades because after takes, yeah, black managed to trade off his bad knight for my bad bishop and his bad bishop for my bad knight. But what happens at the end of all this? Yeah. Queen e8 comes, and now the entire king side will fall. I'm going to pick up a second pawn, and just 2 clean pawns up is just easily enough to win the game. If black plays knight takes g5 to defend against knight takes f7, what should white do? Yes. This brings me to my DVD series, which I will shamelessly plug here as well. If there's ever a goal that you want to accomplish, and your opponent is preventing you from accomplishing that goal, in this case, white clearly wanted to take f7, black prevented it with knight takes g5, the first thing you should always ask yourself is, what happens if I do it anyway? Does he actually prevent me? Here is a very simple case. The answer is a resounding no. Rook e7 is on the way, and this game is over. But, you know, it's just a good thing to keep in mind. So buy my DVD series. It's a good investment. Yeah. If he takes back here, then after rook e7, the queen will be lost, and this is clearly over. So instead of this, black tried rook d8, but after queen takes f7, taking a second pawn, he took here. Now I'm up 1 pawn, trade the queens. Now I'm again up 2 pawns. We just have some knight and rook endgame, 2 pawns up for white. Not too much more to discuss. f3, I played knight f4, hoping to chain this rook down to the d5 pawn, chain the knight down to the fork on e6. King e6, takes, I give a check. King b5, king e2, the knight is now booted away. And after knight g1 check, king d3, my opponent resigned because knight takes d5 is on the way and there's not a darn thing he can do about it. That will be a 3rd pawn up for white. If he plays king a4, I will take this one instead. And now, in fact, black's just mated after knight e6 to c5. And if he plays, the only other thing he can try to save this pawn is king a6, which is obviously a very sad move. And if nothing else, this one will take the 3rd pawn. And with 3 pawns down, I think we can safely understand why he's resigning. So, yeah, this was the game that won me the U.S. Championship. Obviously, it wasn't the only one because I had to finish with 6 wins and 5 draws. It's just this was the last one. And it's the one that, well, it's the one all the pictures came from. So I was happy with it. In any case, we have about 15 minutes left before I have to get lunch or something. But I'd like to open it up for just general Q&A while I'm here. So anything you want. If you ask me something super personal, I might not answer, but you know, just raise your hands and we'll get this going. So any questions? Yes, sir.
As you've risen in ranks and stature, how are you enjoying your games be more scrutinized? Is your training and preparation changing?
Well, I'm certainly trying to train the same way as I did before, and you're getting better at chess, so that means something's working. I'm sort of a don't fix it if it ain't broke kind of guy. I try not to get, it's easy to get a little bit complacent, especially now that I make a ton of money that I didn't before, but I'm motivated more by passion than anything else. I can definitely see how some people are like, oh, now I'm making such a comfortable living, I just want to take my foot off the gas a little bit, but that's not really who I am. As for my games being more scrutinized, I don't really care. I play for the love of the game, not because I care what pundits have to say about them. Yes?
Did you play Magnus Carlsen once?
Yes, I played him a couple weeks ago. I've worked with him and his team in preparation, so I've sparred with him before, but I've only played 1 serious tournament game against Magnus. That was a couple weeks ago. It was a draw.
How does it feel to spar with someone, as you say, now playing in a proper game?
Well, it's less serious, and it's more about learning than it is about sport, which makes it feel very different. And I'm very particular about my routine before games, including like what I eat that morning, what time I eat, what kind of preparation I do, what kind of position I aim for, what time I sleep, things like this, while sparring is much more low-key. But you still learn a lot from doing it, especially if it's done right. Yes?
What are your thoughts on the World Chess Championship that just ended?
I mean, I think Magnus played really, really badly. I mean, realistically, given the kind of positions they got, it should not have been close, but it almost was. I don't know. I mean, look, it was a 6-6 match, so I guess you could say it could have gone either way. It was unfortunate that it was all draws, but I mean, the positions that Magnus didn't win were astonishing to me. I mean, he clearly was not playing his best compared to what he normally is. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, ultimately, I'm really good at chess. I'm number 24 in the world, but that's still a level a bit beyond me, and I can't really talk in too much detail about it because there's probably a lot of things I don't understand. Yeah.
What do you consider for people under 2000?
What do you mean? Sorry, say it again.
What do you consider for people under 2000?
You mean like what they should be doing to improve? Yeah, that's a tough question because you say people under 2,000. I don't know what your rating is. Maybe you're 1,900, but I can promise you're not 1,900 at everything. You're going to be 2,100 at something. You're going to be 1,700 at something. All these random skills that you have mixed together might bring you to an average of 1,900. But in general, I believe if you want to be a good chess player, you need to target specifically the areas where you're weakest. Because in chess, you have to play every position that comes in front of you. If I were to make an analogy, if you're great at passing the ball with your feet, if you're great at running, if you're great at shooting and all this stuff, but you totally suck at stopping the ball with your hands, that's great. Don't be a goalie. In chess, you have to play every position that comes in front of you. And so if you have a weakness in a phase of your game, you're not playing as well as others, you want to target specifically that phase. So for a 1,900 player, let's imagine he's 2,100 at tactics and 1,700 at endgames. I would say study endgames. If he's 2,100 at endgames and 1,700 at tactics, I would say study tactics. So it's very hard for me to give a one-size-fits-all approach, if that makes any sense at all.
What books do you find that help you the most throughout your chess learning, that you got the most out of the book?
The best book I've ever read by far was Dvoretsky's Endgame Manual. It's definitely advanced, but Dvoretsky, may he rest in peace, was I think the greatest chess author, certainly of my lifetime, perhaps of all time. So his books I really liked. And then the Grandmaster Preparation series by Jakob Aagaard I think are very good as well. Yes?
What's your goal in life as far as chess goes?
My goal is to be the world champion. I will almost certainly fail this goal because Magnus is darn good and there's a lot of other people competing with me. But I can guarantee you I will fail this goal if I don't try and if I don't apply myself to the maximum. And ultimately, if you set your sights as high as they possibly can be, even if you come up short, you'll tend to still have made it as far as you can. If I aim to be number 1 in the world and I top out at number 5, that will make me a happier person than if I aim to be number 10 and make it to number 10. So I believe in setting your goals high. My goal is to be a world champion. Unlikely to happen, but I'm going to do my best. Other question? Yes.
So what would be your routine then to get to world champion? What are you studying? You mentioned you have a certain breakfast before you play.
Yeah, I mean, I have a pretty controlled diet during tournaments. Outside of tournaments, I eat like a fatty, but luckily I work out a lot. But no, I mean, generally my routine, I live in Northern California, so still Pacific time zone. I'll wake up in the morning. The first thing I do is get my laptop and check all the games because there's usually tournaments in Europe and Asia, which are, anywhere from 9 to 15 hours ahead. So I'm following the games, checking what's been going on there. I'll do a fair amount of calculation training throughout the day. I try to check my openings, particularly if there are relevant updates or developments from these games that I had just seen. Things like this. I have people coming and training with me. I travel to Europe and Asia to train with them as well. It's a lot of work, but it's working for me so far, and you just have to be patient because it never comes as quickly as you want. Huge success, that is, but if you work hard enough, it usually does. Yes?
What personal challenges have you overcome by being consistent with chess throughout the years?
That's a very, very good question, I have to say. My senior year of college, I faced I really had some trouble emotionally for reasons outside of chess. And I think that playing chess as much as I did and studying it and channeling, I guess you could call it negative emotion or negative energy, into the game and something positive really made a positive impact on me, both in terms of my overall happiness and in terms of my chess playing ability. And in general, when you care about something so deeply, as I care about chess and a couple other things, especially at that time, it hurts beyond belief when they don't come, or when you come up short, or you fail, or you're met with disappointment or even devastation. And ultimately, what chess and such life experiences taught me is how to take a punch. I had a pretty easy life growing up. I'm from a reasonably well-to-do family. I was very talented at chess. I got better really quickly. I never really faced that much challenges. And when I finally really started facing adversity, I learned to not let that crush me. It can scar you, but you can't let it crush you or deter you from keeping on fighting. And I think the biggest example of this can be cited just a couple of weeks ago. In round 11 at Tata Steel, I had the most embarrassing moment of my career. I resigned a technically drawn position against Anish Giri. I thought I was lost. There was a saving resource that I didn't fully understand. I resigned a drawn position that everyone in their computer understood was drawn. I was the laughingstock of the chess world. And then a younger me might have just collapsed. Now that I've been toughened up to some degree, I came back and the next two guys, I just tore their heads off. Particularly the next game I played. My opponent took some real risks early in the game, which I think was a very understandable decision to try to hit someone while they're down. I mean, this is sports. It's what you have to do. You know, capitalize on someone who's in a huge amount of pain and not able to bring their all. Against the younger me, this would have worked, but the way I was feeling that day, I crushed him. And this strength of character is something that chess has taught me because, at least for me, it didn't come naturally. I wasn't always like that. Other questions? Yes?
What's your favorite variant?
I really enjoy the semi-Slav with both colors. I love that there's all this tension in the center that looks so solid, but at any moment the position can explode and tactics can fly everywhere. In general, I like games that are openings that tend to produce very solid positions in general that have the potential to explode very, very quickly, so that it's not so much about preparation in computers, because the positions that are open right away, computers are sort of killing. But the more quiet ones that at some moment clearly will blow up, like the semi-Slav, I really like those. Other questions? Yes?
To get into the candidates to challenge for the World Championship, don't you have to be in the top 8 in ratings? You're going to have to go from 24 to 8. You're going to have to
No.
16 places.
So the candidates to challenge for world champion would be probably the second step of a 3-step plan to getting there. Step 1 is qualify for the candidates. So the way the candidates works is 8 players, I guess, generally you would say these are among the top 9 players in the world, because of course the world champion doesn't play, but it's not strictly done by rating. I think this year there's 2 rating spots, the top 2 finishers from the World Cup, the winner of the FIDE Grand Swiss, and the loser of the previous World Championship match, and the 2 top finishers in the Grand Prix. Now I'm qualified for the World Cup and the Grand Swiss, so that's 3 of the 8 spots are potentially up for grabs for me. I'll have to play out of my mind to get there, but it is within reach in the next cycle. I would just have to play really, really, really well. I was hopeful that more spots would become available to me, and they almost certainly will be in 2022. But there is a universe where I could play the next candidates. Yes.
You said you do a lot of calculation training.
Yeah.
Do you do more of that now than you did, let's say, when you were an international master or just a grandmaster? Just starting to calculate.
I started serious calculation training when I first met my current coach, Jakob Bogart, who's really great. I didn't do much calculation training before that because I just knew I was really good at calculation. And in general, it's what you know doesn't hurt you, or what you don't know doesn't hurt you. What hurts you is what you do know that's just wrong. I was not good at calculation. I believed I was, and I was not. And then when I went to Jakob and found out just how much there was to learn and how much better I could get, and I realized not only how poor I was, but how poor just about everybody else was, and that if I could actually learn to do this, I was going to start killing people. I just decided I'm going to train calculation like no other. A good way to think about it is like the guys who write Komodo and Stockfish in these chess engines, they're like 2,000, 2,200. I mean, their ability to teach a computer how to evaluate chess positions and understand chess should not be higher than mine. But why are computers so much better than us? It's just because they calculate so much better. And this skill is the most important skill in all of chess. And now I really regret not having trained calculation more when I was younger. Yes?
Did you beat an engine once?
Not any good ones. Nowadays, by the time I really got good at chess, we had clearly lost the war against computers. They're just better than us. And I think I sparred with like some old engines, like some old deep frits and stuff, and I could take a game off it out of maybe 20 if I got lucky and got the right kind of position. But against Stockfish or Houdini or Komodo or Leela, forget it. Yes, sir.
Do you want to play a blitz game with me?
Maybe after the Q&A. Yes, sir.
Do you feel that chess is something like that you're kind of born with? Like, do you find that it correlates with like IQ or anything, or is it more about putting in the effort and like learning? Or
Cosmic level questions like that of are you as good as you are because you were born brilliant or because you've worked hard? Ultimately, humans will never know the answers to these questions. I choose to believe that it's more about working hard because that motivates me to work. Honestly, you look at the kind of natural genius that someone like Magnus has, I'm fully aware that it's greater than anything I could imagine, but hard work makes up for a lot. I've always had a theory that if you really dedicate your life to something and pour yourself 110% into it day in and day out, you can easily make it to the top 1% of absolutely anything you want. But beyond that top 1%, you have to have the gift. For example, if I quit chess tomorrow and decided for the rest of my life, every day I'm going to motivate myself towards becoming the best basketball player I can ever be, I would become an amazing basketball player and I would not make the NBA. I think it's clear that I don't have what it takes naturally, but I would get really, really good if I dedicated myself like that. And I think chess is the same way. I think just about anybody can make it to FM, maybe IM, maybe even GM if they've really dedicated their entire lives and made it basically their existence the way I have. Beyond that, I don't know. Yes?
Can you take signatures?
I will take signatures. I will sign books, T-shirts, magazines, whatever you want. Foreheads, you name it. Like Ricky Bobby. Yes?
You said there's something genius about Magnus's game. How does it manifest? What do you think that is?
If I knew what made Magnus the genius he is today, maybe I would be the world champion instead of him. He just has this way of looking at the board and he just knows what moves are most critical. Not necessarily what moves are best, but what moves are most critical. And he's got this sort of Fischer-esque thing when you look at him play. I saw some statistic that of the top 10 players in the world, he matches the top choice of the computer the least of all of them. And he matches the top 3 the most, which essentially means that Magnus might not play the best move any more often than anyone else, but he always plays a good move. And just this lack of serious mistakes because his natural feel is so great. Again, he's so much better than me that it's really hard for me to comment on it. I mean, look, even at number 24 in the world, there's so much difference between the two of us. It's hard for me to truly understand what goes on in his mind because he's just so much stronger. Yeah?
What's your opinion if you saw the games on the Alpha Zero games against Stockfish?
Alpha Zero against Stockfish didn't interest me so much because it clearly was done behind closed doors and under different kinds of supervision, and Alpha Zero clearly was much stronger, but it was not. Alpha Zero cannot run on the kind of computers that a normal person can have. It's only on very specific hardware. I was much more interested that Leela Zero recently beat Stockfish, or at least took the lead over Stockfish last I checked in the TCEC. Now, it wasn't demolition like Alpha Zero, but still that the AI engine, I guess a weaker version, ultimately beat the Stockfish that humans developed. That was a much more interesting match to me, seeing the contrast in styles. And I don't know. I don't try to spend that much effort on computer chess just because I'm more focused on beating humans. So if you want to beat a computer, good luck. Other questions? All right, so that takes us to 11:30. It's really been a pleasure being here with you all, and I'm happy to sign some books or other stuff, take some pictures as you wish, and thanks all for coming. Yeah, sure.